Recently, I got an email from a viewer saying, "Hey Frank, why don't you build a cornhole board out of concrete?" And since I thought the idea was really interesting, I immediately started researching whether something like that already exists. And I have to say the selection online was very limited. 1,200 euros? That's a hefty price. So you might as well just build one yourself. Alright, let's see how it goes. Building it shouldn't be rocket science. We've already got the official plans with the exact measurements. You can find them all over the internet, and there are two versions. The American one is 120 centimeters long, and the German one is only 90. And we're going to build the German version. First, we need some formwork timber. Today, we're building entirely out of old formwork material, because as you know, don't waste, reuse. If you have little kids, then you also know where that saying comes from. Seen it 1,000 times on TV. Alright, let's get started. The board I just showed you online was pretty bulky and quite heavy in terms of design, so it's going to weigh quite a bit, and I've planned something a little different. In terms of design, of course, you don't have a lot of options because a board is basically just a ramp, nothing more, nothing less. But I've planned to add a few cutouts so that the design looks a bit different and a little more stylish. When it comes to weight, I want to save quite a bit. I've planned for the board to be only 15 millimeters thick. That will definitely be a challenge with concrete, but this way you can move it around the garden at any time and don't have to keep it in one spot all the time. Now the question arises, why does something like this even have to be made out of concrete? So basically, it doesn't have to be made of concrete, as you can see, because most boards you find online are made of wood. But I think it's a good idea because it's a weather-resistant option. You can leave it outside in the garden even when it rains, nothing will happen to it. And yeah, of course it also has a certain weight, so it's stable. I don't know if that's a good idea. Feel free to let me know in the comments. But in any case, I'm going to go ahead and do it here with only 15 millimeters. Let's see if it works out the way I imagined. We've now got the large pieces from the cut ready. We still need a few small ones, we'll do those later. Now let's continue with the interior construction. For the hole, it's best to use styrodur and we'll mark it out with the compass here. The diameter is 15 centimeters, so let's mark that out now. At this point, just a quick note about comments that often appear under videos like this. So yeah, I'll just call it criticism. It's about when you build something, a do-it-yourself project, and then compare it to prices offered online, like I did in this case again. A lot of people write, "Don't do that, it's not appropriate." Well, actually, I think it is because the manufacturer of the product isn't being attacked here. Whether the price is justified is something everyone has to decide for themselves. I'm not going to judge that here. And on the other hand, I also think it's important, especially when you make these do-it-yourself videos, because what motivates you to build something yourself? Either you want to save money, or you enjoy building the product or project yourself, maybe even both. And I do think it's important to know what it ultimately costs, so that everyone can decide for themselves when they watch this video whether the effort and materials are worth it to them, or if they'd rather just buy it. So that's up to everyone. With that in mind, I'll continue to do it this way, because that's how I see it. Others are welcome to see it differently, but that's my opinion on the matter. In this particular case, the 1,200 euros might seem high at first glance, I have to say. But when you consider the amount of manual labor involved, including the time spent working on it, I'd say it's more than justified. These are small production runs being made here, and you just can't get something like that everywhere. And if you want something like that, then you just have to pay the price. Or you can build it yourself, like I'm showing you in this video. And later on, I'll also tell you how much I spent on materials and, most importantly, how much time I put into it. Alright, that wraps up this topic. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm going to build it a bit differently in terms of design. That's why I've now cut out these styrodur inserts. I'm going to glue them in on the sides here, which will make the whole thing look a bit more delicate. And of course, we'll also save a bit of weight this way. The weight savings here aren't huge, of course, but since we're making the board so delicate, it won't end up being particularly heavy overall. I've calculated it and we'll end up at around 20 kilograms, which I think is already a good result. That's still easy enough for one person to carry. Of course, we also need a boundary at the top. For that, I've cut these strips here. They stick out exactly 15 millimeters, which will also be the thickness of our concrete, just like I mentioned earlier. Now these will be attached all the way around as well. Well, things are moving along pretty well again today. It would be nice if it went like this every time. Now we'll add a silicone joint all around the outside so that the mold is sealed and we get rounded edges, but you already know all about that. And with that, the mold is finished. Then we move on to the more challenging part, the concreting, because that's going to be a real challenge again today. First, there's the mold. Everything will be laminated, and as I said, it will only be 15 millimeters thick. But we'll get to that in just a moment. As a special design idea, I also thought about adding an arrow to the front of the board that points to the hole. And for that, I got myself a very thin, self-adhesive film. Later, this will be stuck into the mold, and the outline of the arrow should then be faintly visible in the concrete. Well, at least that's the idea. Let's see if it works. Well, it will definitely work. The only question is how it will turn out, and above all, how it will look. And that's exactly what's always exciting when you try out new things. We'll find out soon enough. So that's it for building the mold. Now we move on to the more interesting part, concreting. And for that, we'll start by mixing the concrete. You actually need a special kind of concrete for this. With such a thin material thickness, we definitely need a high strength mix. Ideally, it should be quite fine grained so that you can laminate it well later. And for my project, we're mixing the concrete ourselves. I'm making a mix here of cement, sand, limestone and microsilica. Since I used white cement here and the aggregates are also quite light, I added a little bit of black pigment. That way you get the typical concrete gray tone. I wouldn't have liked it completely white here. That's why the pigments. You can get all the ingredients you need for this in our shop, and you'll also find the recipe in the shop or on our blog. Feel free to check it out. One problem when producing high-strength concrete is that you have to work with a very low water-cement ratio so that the concrete achieves its strength later on. And then you have the problem that the concrete doesn't really mix well. That's why normally a high dosage of superplasticizer is used, but in our project that's not possible because we also have to work with the concrete vertically later on. So the concrete needs to be sticky and must also adhere to the formwork. But even here, we can't do without any superplasticizer at all. As you can see, the consistency is really stiff. And in this case, I've only added a very small amount of superplasticizer. I dosed it slowly until the concrete reached the right consistency. And after that, I added fibers for reinforcement. These are the 24 millimeter long integral fibers. They act as reinforcement and are significantly stronger than the short dispersible fibers. They are then simply mixed into the already prepared concrete. And when the consistency looks like this, so as I said, firm and sticky in texture, you can start concreting. In this case, as already mentioned, the concrete is not poured, but laminated. This means it is applied to the surface in thin layers. When laminating, you should always work in such a way that the concrete overlaps. This way, you'll have fewer air pockets later and a more even appearance. Compaction in this case is done by pressing down, that is, by tapping the surface of the concrete. And you have to work very precisely at the corners. So you need to compact carefully there, because air pockets tend to form more often in those spots. And this is how you gradually finish the entire surface. The concrete sets relatively quickly, so you can touch it up a bit with a water sprayer. And then, once you're done with the bottom surface, you move on to the side walls. Yes, and you just have to make sure to press the concrete on properly so that it adheres well. And yeah, that's really all there is to it. Because the fibers alone aren't enough for reinforcement, an additional reinforcing mesh is added. This mesh is made of basalt, and basalt is extremely strong, with a very high tensile strength, higher than that of regular fiberglass. And with basalt, you also have the advantage that if the concrete part ever needs to be disposed of, you don't have to separate it from the concrete during recycling. You can simply dispose of it together with the concrete because basalt is, after all, just a type of stone. And as you can see, the mesh is simply worked into the top layer. It should always be placed quite far down, meaning at what will later be the underside of the slab, because that's where it can absorb the most forces. And then we're actually already done. So I think it looks pretty good like this. We can leave it like that. It turned out to be more work than I expected, and I have to say I'm feeling a bit uneasy about it. I'm concerned that the long fibers I added might end up being visible on the surface later because they didn't really, integrate well with the dry concrete. Well, we can't change it now. We'll have to wait until tomorrow. Let's cover the whole thing up and then we're done for the day. I hope all this work wasn't for nothing, but, well, we'll see tomorrow. I was able to remove the formwork from the concrete piece the very next day in less than 24 hours. With this high-strength concrete, it goes super fast. It sets really quickly. And now the only question left was, what does the surface look like? Did the whole thing work out with the fibers? Or, is it all just for the trash can? Overnight, I was already imagining that I'd probably have to grab a hammer the next day, smash the whole thing up and take it to the recycling center, but luckily that wasn't the case. I think a lot of you who work with concrete from time to time have probably felt the same way. You could say that working with concrete is not a hobby for the faint of heart. Phew, guys. Luckily my fears didn't come true. The surface actually turned out pretty well, and most importantly, you can't see any fibers on the surface. Thankfully they didn't show through. You can see a few air pockets on the surface, but that's not a big deal. That's usually the case when laminating, and we'll fix those now as well. I've already mixed up a very fine mortar for this and will apply it to the surface now. This whole process is called concrete cosmetics. I mixed the mortar from limestone powder, cement, microsilica, and a bit of color pigment so that the color matches. And then the surface is lightly moistened and the mortar is rubbed into it. It's important to treat the entire surface because otherwise you might end up with slight color differences later on. After that, you let the mortar set for a while and then you can sand the surface flat, meaning you sand down any excess. I use grits of 400 and 600 for this. You shouldn't start with anything too coarse, otherwise you'll ruin the exposed concrete surface. And this is what the finished surface looks like. Perfect, no more air pockets. So friends, the board is finally finished and I have to say, I'm really super satisfied with the result. It turned out exactly the way I imagined it. Well, maybe the arrow could have been a bit more visible, but that's fine too. Yeah, just a few words about the costs and the time involved. So in terms of cost, it was really manageable. I ended up spending about 50 euros if you break down all the materials to the amount used. And the working time was about 8 hours. So I think that's absolutely fine. Now we're going to apply the sealant so the whole thing is weatherproof, and then I'll show you how to play with this thing, yeah. I'll test it out with my little one. I'll show you a few more pictures. So let's put on the sealant and then we're good to go. At this point, just a quick note about the costs. I don't think you could do it much cheaper. Even if you had built the whole thing out of wood, we probably would have ended up at about the same price because a sheet of plywood is also pretty expensive. So I don't think it's over the top to have built it out of concrete. Of course, the working time is a bit longer. Now we just have to set the whole thing up in the garden, and as you can see, the weight is really manageable. You can easily carry it by yourself. For those of you who don't know how the cornhole game works, it's really simple. Basically, the goal is just to throw fabric bags filled with corn into the hole. And well, it's actually not that easy at all, depending on precisely how far away you choose to stand. It can indeed be quite a significant challenge, and it's a truly excellent way to practice and refine your aiming skills and precision. So I think this game is really not bad for kids. I think it's definitely a cool idea, and it might be interesting for some of you as well. And our little one really enjoyed it too, and with a bit of practice he kept getting better. So after watching this video, you now know what you should build next for your family. Take care. With that, we're done for today. Thank you for watching. All the best. Bye.